Welcome to the Wade Center's podcast.
A podcast of Wheaton College. It says Christianity is a God mysticism, not a soul mysticism, in that it's an upward journey to be united with God rather than inward journey to try to find a place in your soul. And Lewis said that he thought a lot of Eastern mysticism probably pointed to valid experiences. He said that often Christianity takes truths from other religions and clarifies them and perfects them. And you need the trellis of a really solid theology upon which to build mystical encounters. And the two main things that includes are the Trinity and the Incarnation.
Hello, this is David and Crystal and Aaron back in the basement for our Wade Center podcast. And the topic of today's conversation is mysticism, largely because David's best book, at least in my opinion, is a focus on the mysticism of C.S. Lewis. And it is called Into the Region of Awe. It has been somewhat controversial. So we want to talk about the whole issue of mysticism and how our seven authors relate to it. But first, David, why don't you explain to us what led you to write this book?
Okay, well, when I was writing an earlier book called Most Reluctant Convert, I was tracing Lewis's spiritual pilgrimage from losing his faith in his early teens to recovering it in his early 30s. And in reading his books and letters, I was struck by how often he was reading mystical writers. And so I started saying, we always think of Lewis as the Lord's logician. He's the proponent of rational Christianity. So why is he quoting Teresa of Avila, and why is he quoting Ignatius of Loyola and so many other figures? So it actually came out of an earlier book project when I felt like there was a side of Lewis that had been neglected in many of the earlier studies of his philosophical and theological journey.
Do you want to talk a little bit about the resistance you got to publishing this book?
Well, Lewis drew very heavily on Christian tradition. So he talks about Origen and Augustine and Thomas Aquinas, Teresa of Avila, St. John of the Cross. And people said, you make Lewis sound like a Catholic. And it kind of ruffled their Protestant sensibilities. And I say, before the Reformation, we were all Catholics. Augustine belongs to us and Aquinas belongs to us.
Yeah, if you quote anybody before Luther, you're going to be quoting a Catholic.
Right.
In fact, wasn't Luther an Augustinian friar? And that is partly what led him to initiate the Reformation.
Yeah, that's true.
Yeah.
But he also, he had a mystical side. Remember the famous incident where he threw an ink pot at the devil? I wouldn't know if I'd call that mysticism, but it was definitely not your normal rational inquiry when you're throwing ink pots at figures that appear in your study there.
Yeah.
Well, maybe before we get any farther, we need a definition of mysticism so that we all know where you are coming from.
Right. Okay. Well, that's a good question because it's a very nebulous term once again. We talked about romanticism. And some people, when they think mysticism, literally you can go into a bookstore and it says New Age, Tarot, palmistry, mysticism. And they think it just means occult studies. And certainly that's not what we mean by Christian mysticism. Other people have an image of this emaciated friar in a cell somewhere seeing this holy holograph of a saint or of Jesus. And once again, the visionary mysticism isn't really the key to Christian mysticism. Lewis said it's the direct experience of God as concrete as a taste or a color. And that was his definition of mysticism. Often you can contemplate God, you can think about God, you can do theology, but he was very interested in direct experiences of God. He loved them in the Bible. Every single passage of a theophany, Moses in the burning bush, Elijah in the still small voice, Ezekiel in the wheels within wheels, Paul at the road to Damascus. Virtually every famous incident of a direct epiphany or theophany Lewis latched onto and either quoted in his books or referenced in Narnia. He would have sort of an imaginative retelling of those stories.
Do you see that interest in mysticism tying in any way to his fascination with joy and meaning Sehnsucht, that feeling that ultimately led him to Christianity?
I do think so. He was very interested in the experience of God or the intuition of God in consciousness. And Sehnsucht would be one of his arguments that we have eternity in our hearts, as Ecclesiastes says. Also, numinous experiences. He was very interested in Rudolf Otto's The Idea of the Holy. And he wrote a whole book about these markers in both Christian literature and classical literature.
Yeah, we have that book at the Wade Center, Lewis's copy of Otto.
Are there many annotations in it? Have you looked?
Yeah, I have looked at it, yeah. And there are a number of places where he underlines and marks next to things.
Yeah.
Otto goes through and looks at different sort of theologians and thinkers talking about this idea of the numinous or the holy. And yeah, you can tell that Lewis has gone through that and looked at it. And at least looked at these theologians through the lens of Otto. Yeah, it's very interesting.
That's what's so wonderful about the Wade. It archives not just things written by Lewis, but it has these books from his library, so we can see his own process of intellectual development, things that really grabbed his attention.
Yeah.
Yes, but doesn't it cost a lot of money to have access to all these valuable treasures?
Yes, people don't realize that the Wade is entirely self-funded.
Oh, is that right?
Yes.
Wow. So donations
is this a mystical experience you're having right now?
This is an infomercial. Yes, but isn't whitening toothpaste too expensive? No, it's quite affordable. Lewis often recommended Rudolf Otto. As a matter of fact, when someone asked him late in life what 4 books most influence his thinking, he mentioned Rudolf Otto and another scholar of mysticism, Edwin Bevan, and as well as Dorothy Sayers.
Yes.
He mentioned.
Thank you.
Get in that plug. Now, doesn't it cost money to read Dorothy Sayers? I already played that card. I wanted to quickly just review some of the things that Rudolf Otto talks about. The numinous experience is the sense of the other. You have a direct intuition or experience of something so much beyond human scale that it's intimidating, but it's exhilarating. And Otto mentions 6 markers of numinous experiences. Fear or awe or holy dread, the fear of the Lord. Think of the first time in Narnia when they hear Aslan is on the move. And all 4 children have this response that something numinous, something really awe-inspiring is happening here. I should mention the word awe later, why I called this book Into the Region of Awe. But Otto also says fascination, attraction, yearning. You're almost magnetized by the experience. A sense of majestas, a sense of ineffable magnitude. Energy, urgency, intense dynamism, like stored up electricity. Otto mentions the incident where the Ark of the Covenant seems to be unsteady, and a soldier reaches out and tries to steady it, and he's immediately killed. He's almost like he's electrocuted. That's often the experience of intense energy that you get from this sense of an encounter with the divine. Wonder, astonishment, stupefaction. Someone like Paul on the road to Damascus, where he can't even speak. He's both blinded and loses his sense of speech. And then mystery, absolute unapproachability. There's something here that goes beyond the power of words to express. So Lewis referred to those traits, and he often put those traits into his books and his fiction.
Yeah, you see those they have those experiences at the end of Paralandra, at the end of That Hideous Strength, with the different gods coming down at St. Anne's and those kinds of things. Yeah.
And I want to mention, Crystal asked me earlier how I got onto this idea. And part of it was just running into passages that seemed so counter to my image of Lewis as I knew him as a college student. And you'd be reading along in Out of the Silent Planet, and it's an otherworldly adventure. And he's discovering that the medieval Christian worldview is actually more accurate than that of the villains. But at one point, he's talking to one of the Harasa, one of these otter-like creatures that lives on Mars or Malacandra. And this creature's name is Hoyoi. And he says, I will tell you a day in my life that has shaped me, such a day as comes only once, like love. Then I was young, not much more than a cub, and I went far, far up in the highlands where the stars shine at midnight and even water is cold. A great waterfall I climbed. I stood there on the shore of Balky the Pool, which is the place of most awe in all worlds. There's that word, awe. The walls of it go up forever and ever, and huge and holy images are cut into them, the work of old times. There is the fall called the Mountain of Water, because I stood there alone, Meleldil and I. Meleldil's the god figure. Ever since then, my heart has been higher, my song deeper all my days. And it's very interesting. In the middle of this novel, this character described going up alone to a place where you can see the stars in the midday, and he's alone with Meleldil, the god figure of the Ransom trilogy. So I kept running across those passages and thinking, there's an interest here in Lewis that hasn't been explored very much in other commentators on Lewis.
Yeah, and Ransom has a number of those encounters himself when he's on the spaceship, on the way there and on the way back, and
Right. And in Perelandra, when he's really angry about having to do something about Weston, there's a scene in which he feels a terrible silence because he's afraid of the idea of having to physically do combat with Weston, the villain. And he says at first there was a terrible silence, but then he thought he saw a face waiting for him to end up all his complaints and rationalizations. And finally a voice says, "It is not for nothing you are called Ransom. My name is also Ransom." So that's kind of a mystical encounter when he goes from silence to the shape of a face to an actual voice speaking to him. And those are the kind of incidents that Lewis liked to recreate imaginatively in his fiction.
Why do you think there is such antipathy among many Protestants to mysticism? And this actually affected the publication of David's book. People didn't even want to touch it, even though he had all this data proving Lewis's interest. But there was this prejudice against even addressing the possibility of Lewis's fascination with mysticism.
Well, I think there are well-grounded fears about people claiming that they heard voices of God or saw a vision of God. Most cults and heresies begin with someone who claims they have a new revelation from God. And in some ways, we said last week that classicists and romanticists need each other. I think in some ways, Catholics and Protestants need each other.
Yes. Yes.
And many of Lewis's protégés ended up becoming Roman Catholics, not Anglicans. They felt that the Anglican Church was so cut and dried that it did not leave room for the ongoing supernatural action of the divine in our lives. When you believe that every week taking communion is a direct participation in the divine nature, an assimilation of the divine nature, that's different than a rational view. Lewis said in Allegory of Love that when Catholics go astray, their religion is like all other religions. It's about priesthoods and talismans and magic formulas. He says when Protestants go astray, their religion is like no religion at all. It just becomes ethical platitudes. So I think that I had a reviewer from a Baptist publication who said, Downing never convinces me that Lewis had any interest in mysticism. I have over 40 quotations of mystics or quotations about mysticism.
By Lewis himself.
By Lewis. And he said he never convinced me. And
I think he didn't want to be convinced.
Yeah. Remember that old line from Paul Simon, a man hears what he wants to hear and disregards the rest.
I come from a Southern Baptist background, and there's a huge focus within that denomination of Scripture being the only method of revelation and encounter with God. And so anytime you sort of encourage people to seek God or to hear from Him or to receive any sort of experience or revelation outside of Scripture, it's viewed almost like sort of a cult, and mysticism itself is sort of a bad word. It's associated with people straying from the word. And so you have biblicism it being sort of anti-mysticism. And so Lewis is so well loved among Southern Baptists and a lot of evangelicals that I think they don't want to see that side of him.
And I think they are correct. If someone says, I received a new revelation, and there's actually 4 persons of the Trinity, in some way, and Lewis made the point that mystics don't claim to come up with new truths. They simply claim that what had been a notional truth, an abstract conceptual truth, becomes an existential reality. One of the mysticism scholars that he loved, Evelyn Underhill, said that mysticism takes you from saying, this is what I believe, to this is the reality I need to align myself with. So you could claim it's less about new truths than it is about energizing and vivifying the truths that we already affirm.
So, Crystal, you kind of mentioned this as well, but a lot of people do associate mysticism with sort of Eastern religions and those kinds of things. And you've mentioned that Christian mysticism is different, but how is Christian mysticism different? Because in a lot of those other kinds of mysticism, aren't they seeking some sort of encounter with a divine being?
That's a good question. Our man Rudolf Otto, this book, Idea of the Holy, is 1923, and he said Eastern mysticisms tend to be what he called soul mysticism, which is turning inward to find the ultimate reality. And he says we're trying to escape fretful, self-conscious states of mind in order to achieve peace and harmony and resignation to the world as it is. Where he says Christianity is a God mysticism, not a soul mysticism, in that it's an upward journey to be united with God rather than inward journey to try to find a place in your soul. And Lewis said that he thought a lot of Eastern mysticism probably pointed to valid experiences. He said that often Christianity takes truths from other religions and clarifies them and perfects them. So
baptizes them.
Yes. And following Evelyn Underhill, he said, you need the trellis of a really solid theology upon which to build mystical encounters. And the two main things that includes are the Trinity and the Incarnation. So he had an interesting analogy of experiences of God. This is a Mere Christianity. Someone said to him, well, when I was in North Africa during the war, I was out in the desert under the stars, and I had this incredible encounter with God. Who are you to tell me that your Christian theology describes God when I've had this experience? And Lewis said, I think he probably did have an encounter with God, but it's like experiencing the Atlantic Ocean versus having a map of the Atlantic. Somebody in Cornwall could say, oh, I've seen the Atlantic Ocean. It's big and blue and windy and turbulent, and it pounds the cliffs of Cornwall. And another person in East Anglia could say, I've seen the Atlantic Ocean. It's kind of flat and brown, and it comes in on mud flats, and it's kind of looks like a giant pond. Both of their experiences were valid, but what theology does, it takes everyone's experiences of God, and it systematizes them, and it shows you the whole thing. So he said, you don't want just a map without ever having an experience of the ocean if you can see it, but you don't want to claim that your personal experience of the ocean is all that you need. You don't need to look at a map of the Atlantic. I thought that was a good analogy.
Yeah.
What strikes me is this is one of those issues that degenerates into either or thought. So there's excess on both extremes. And so there's some people who just are seeing the face of Jesus on a tortilla and say, oh, I've had a theophany, there's the face, or even the Shroud of Turin, and these where people just want these types of proofs. And then the counter reaction to that, and it's an understandable counter reaction, is, oh, that is silly. God has spoken to us through Scripture, kind of going back to what you were saying, Aaron. But then it becomes so tied to what Dorothy Sayers called bibliolatry, in that the people don't realize that they are reading the Bible through the lens of a certain interpretive paradigm. So the trouble is the Bible then can be used to support cultural attitudes that people want, and they close themselves off to God speaking to us in new ways.
Yeah. Or just allowing the Spirit to tell you that you're reading their Bible wrong.
Yeah, that's right.
Yeah. Even just saying, am I reading this right? And asking God, as if that in and of itself is a bad idea. Yeah, definitely.
Once again, the Trinity. How does the Holy Spirit guide us?
You mentioned the Shroud of Turin. One of Lewis's friends sent him a picture of the Shroud of Turin, and he hung it on his wall and kept it there most of his life. But he said, I'm not going to comment on its authenticity, but it's such a wonderful reminder that Jesus Christ really was dead before he rose again.
Yeah.
Huh.
Right.
He tended to suspend judgment on issues like that because he knew they were divisive.
Right.
And I think he wisely took what he could from that image, but he didn't try to make a judgment about whether or not he...
You can also see there's a long tradition. You mentioned the Catholic mysticism. There's a long tradition of sort of, setting up the teeth of John the Baptist or the pinky finger of, such and such. And then people make pilgrimages to go see that. And that's kind of counter both mysticism and biblicism. It's sort of like what are you going to get out of the pinky finger of Saint David counting?
Yeah, and that's a good analogy because I grew up hearing about these things in reliquaries and the fact that Thomas Aquinas, after he died, they boiled his body to remove all the flesh so that they could save his bones and send them off to various churches so you could go and see and kiss the bone of Thomas Aquinas. If I'm remembering correctly, I may be perpetuating an error. But the whole point I bring that up is that when you say that God supports segregation in Genesis 1, I see that as very little different than boiling the flesh off the bones of a famous theologian. It turns the Bible into an idol.
You take a little piece of it and set that up as an idol.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Well, some people try to use the Bible as their tarot cards when they just open the Bible and point to a verse to see if it gives them guidance.
I've done that before.
Right.
Oh.
You're telling me you've never done that?
Well, I was asking my dad about that once, and he said, "Oh yeah, a friend of mine." He claimed, this is a story. He claimed that his friend tried that, and the first time it said, "And then Judas went and hung himself," and so he changed the page and tried again, and it said, "Go thou and do likewise." That was my dad's take on trying to find mystical guidance from Scripture. You mentioned Thomas Aquinas. He's also listed as a mystic because late in life, at 1272, soon before he died, he'd been spending all this time on the Summa Theologica trying to reconcile Aristotelian philosophy with Christian theology. And he had some kind of a breakdown or an experience while giving Mass, and people asked him about the project and whether he was going to finish it. And he said, I consider that to be like straw. And someone else had to finish it. Yeah. And Lewis quoted that in Letters to Malcolm, chiefly on, what was the phrase, Aaron?
I think it's so much straw or something like that.
Yeah.
It's been requoted a lot of times.
Yeah. Crystal said, Aaron's here with us. It's not our love child. This is Aaron Hill, our producer. So you wonder.
David.
Of course, even Luther, he regarded the book of James. He called it a book of straw.
An epistle of straw.
Right.
Yeah.
Because, once again, it countered his paradigm. And so he was reacting to a type of ritualistic approach where if you go and kiss a bone of Aquinas, you will be saved. If you buy so many indulgence papers, you get through purgatory.
Yeah.
And because the book of James says faith without works is dead, he just didn't want to even acknowledge works.
Yeah.
And the reason I bring this up is it is so hard to maintain this balance. It's so easy to fall into either or extremes, either totally uncritical accepting of any report of mystical experiences or uncritical denunciation of any mystical experiences. And we have a Savior who, rather than either or, is both and. And I think I've talked about this before, partly because Dorothy Sayers was so committed to this. She says, we as Christians are called to walk the razor edge of a delicate balance. And I think her metaphor of razor edge is interesting because it's not easy to walk it. It hurts to walk it. Yeah. It's so much easier to just fall into one extreme or the other where you can get the reinforcement of all these people who like either or thought.
Yeah.
And that's one of the reasons I so value the authors at the Wade, because they are exploring how can we endorse the both and of Jesus Christ, who is both fully human and fully God, a doctrine that was established in 325 at the Council of Nicaea, by inculcating that very attitude to everything we approach.
Yeah. Yeah, your paradigm has to account for both of those things. So David, getting back to Lewis and mysticism, how did Lewis himself get into mysticism? How does he get started with this? I know that he had some encounters. Didn't he have an experience of with Aleister Crowley or something like that when he was younger? How did he get into mysticism?
Well, that was the part about occultism, which I wouldn't use the word mysticism to talk about Aleister Crowley and occultism. he had kind of a negative experience of spiritual realities. He read some occultic writers.
Explain who Aleister Crowley is.
He was sort of a 20th century spiritualist, almost Satanist. Supposedly, Aleister Crowley, he was British. Supposedly, he killed someone in a psychic duel. They had this duel, kind of like Saruman and Aragorn, looking at each other through the palantir, and the guy died. So he was a very strange figure and a disturbing figure.
Yeah.
But Lewis was turned off to that fairly early as a teenager.
Okay.
Partly when his adoptive mother, Janie Moore's brother, Doc Askins, got very interested in the Kabbalah and the occult and spiritualism. And he had a nervous breakdown, and he felt that demons were trying to drag him down into hell. He, Doc Askins. And Lewis was right there at his bedside, and he saw this man losing his mind. And he wasn't a Christian yet, but he started using the word "the enemy" with a capital E in his letters. He Lewis. Excuse me. Well, the other guy had a nervous breakdown, so sorry about my lack of
still
nouns.
Write letters.
Yeah.
We're going to teach David how to use pronouns one of these days.
Anyway, so that was kind of the negative side. He felt he had been a materialist, but he started feeling there was some spiritual dimension pressing upon our everyday reality. But it came at him first from a negative side of seeing the almost the satanic. As he got to know Tolkien, and Barfield really pressed him on this issue of chronological snobbery. He also read Evelyn Underhill, this wonderful scholar on mysticism. And
I wonder what led him to first read it.
She was very popular. She wrote her books in the early 20th century. T.S. Eliot also read her a lot.
Oh, okay.
And it was a new idea for people that apart from Christian spirituality, there was a specific tradition of people who were seeking the direct experience of God. Now, she and other scholars have talked about spontaneous mysticism, where you're on the road to Damascus and you had this sudden experience that you weren't planning for. That's actually a theophany. Blaise Pascal, the famous mathematician and philosopher, had this one particular evening late at night, which is an example of spontaneous mysticism, and which Lewis refers to again in his books. Let me read a quick passage from Pascal, the French philosopher and mathematician. The other kind is cultivated mysticism, where you actually think that if you purify your spirit and purge your spirit, you're going to have a better sense of clarity of God's nature within you.
Yeah, purgation.
Purgation, right.
There's whole prayers and procedures and things that were established and talked about by theologians within the Catholic Church of ways of seeking those kinds of experiences.
Right. That's called the mystical way, and that's one of the things. That's the title of one of Underhill's books. This is Pascal. He actually put down on a piece of paper, 10:30 p.m., November 23rd, 1654. And Pascal writes, "Fire, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, the God of Jacob, not of philosophers and intellectuals, certitude, feeling, joy, peace, the God of Jesus Christ, my God and your God will be my God. Forgetfulness of the world and everything except God. One finds oneself only by way of directions found in the Gospels, the grandeur of the human soul. O just Father, the world has not known you, but I have known you. Joy, tears of joy." So he wrote that on a piece of paper. He didn't tell anyone about it, but when he died, they found this piece of paper folded up and sewn into his jacket.
Clothes, yeah.
Oh, wow.
So, yeah, and a lot of his Christian faith, as you can see, was energized by direct experience. It wasn't just through rational inquiry or rational.
Yeah.
The other kind, cultivated mysticism, Lewis said that your spirit is like a lens or a telescope. If you're trying to look at the stars or the moon through a dirty telescope or a cracked telescope, you're going to see distortions. There's going to be a lack of focus. You might even, he says, you might see these features of the moon that are actually smudges on your telescope. So he saw the mystical way as cleansing the lens of your spirit so that you could experience the fullness of the divine much more clearly and fully. And the mystical way tends to be the soul awakening to God, says Evelyn Underhill, and then a period of purgation, trying to get rid of selfishness and egotistical concerns, and then illumination, and then finally the dark night of the soul,
Mm-hmm.
which is the final kind of death of the ego and the realization that God is all and we are very finite.
Yeah, St.
And
John
that-
of the Cross.
Exactly, who Lewis once again quotes. I'm still thinking of this Baptist reviewer who said, I'm not convinced he was interested. I was going, who do you think these people are? Who do you think St. John of the Cross is? And then the last one is walking with God or marriage with God or communion with God.
Yeah.
And this often is a lifelong process. The purgation and illumination can go back and forth your whole life. It's not as if you take a 5-step program and then you've arrived.
That's interesting because Sayers started getting interested in mysticism upon reading Dante,
Right.
which makes sense
Right.
Yeah.
because Dante had what Sayers calls the Beatrician vision.
Right.
So he, as a young boy, sees this Beatrice figure, and it wasn't erotic. It just signaled for him the idea that there is truth beyond the physical appearance of things, kind of like Lewis's experience of what he calls joy or sensate, this awareness that there has to be more to existence.
Mm-hmm.
But Sayers says, she wrote a whole essay called The Beatrician Vision in Dante and Other Poets. And she says, as far as Dante was concerned, what endorses the fact that somebody has had a mystical experience is the manifestation of love towards others
Right,
in their life.
right.
Yeah.
And that is a very important distinction because I think some people get into, what was it called? Self-generated mysticism? What's not the-
Cultivated mysticism.
cultivated mysticism. It becomes narcissistic. Oh, I want this experience. And, some people take drugs, but I'm going to try for a mystical experience. But if it is not manifest in Christ's love being manifest in you afterwards, that's one way to judge its authenticity.
Right. And Lewis contrasted genuine mysticism with magic or drug experiences. He said the departures could be very similar. You feel like you're escaping the world. You feel like you're encountering something much larger than your finite self. But he said the real crowning of the voyage is where you arrive. So even you can have magical departures that feel mystical or drug-induced states, but it's ultimately your arrival that makes that mystical experience. He also said the reason we listen to the mystics of the church is because they were so saintly, we are willing to entertain their mystical experiences. We don't think of them as saintly just because they had mystical experiences. And a lot of the great
That's
mystics
important.
were leaders of the church. They weren't these
Augustine
hermits.
and his mother had a mystical experience.
Exactly. Augustine was mystical. Teresa of Avila founded a new order. Hildegard of Bingen, Bernard of Clairvaux, the famous hymn, Jesus the very thought of thee with sweetness fills my breast. That's from Bernard of Clairvaux, who started this Cistercian order. So they weren't really
And
hermits.
St. Paul.
St. Paul, that's right.
That's a pretty important one.
Well, Lewis very cleverly works in St. Paul once again in his fiction. He loves these verbal echoes because Paul was called up into the third heaven at Damascus. He says at the beginning of Galatians, my authority is not from men, but from Jesus Christ. So he sees his experiences as validating him as an apostle.
Yeah.
I wanted to read another passage from That Hideous Strength. Lewis liked to quote St. Paul the mystic in his fiction, or at least echo him. And there's a famous passage in That Hideous Strength where Jane Studdick finally realizes that her journey and her spending time with the community at St. Anne's is really leading her to this moment where she realizes that her modest outfit of ideas, as he calls it, are falling away when she has this moment of encounter. This is from That Hideous Strength. This is Jane Studdick. A boundary had been crossed. She had come into a world or into a person, capital P, or into the presence of a person. Something expectant, patient, inexorable, met her with no veil or protection between. In this height and depth and breadth, the little idea of herself, which she had hitherto called me, dropped down and vanished, unfluttering into a bottomless distance, like a bird in a space without air. And he says the sense of height and depth and breadth, the little idea of herself, that sense of magnitude, don't you think he has to be echoing Paul in Ephesians, where he says, I wish, brethren, that you would have a sense of the height and depth and the fullness of God. So I think he does that on purpose. He also liked to capture mystical moments in the Narnia Chronicles. There's one in The Horse and His Boy where Aslan disappears in this swirling shower of gold, which reminds you very much not only of the shower of oceans in Perelandra, but also of Ezekiel when he sees the wheels within the wheels. There's another scene in which Shasta says, who are you? And the voice says, myself, 3 times. But the first time it's kind of a booming voice. And the second time it's more of a loving, nurturing voice. And the third time it's a whispering voice. And he says it was like the wind among the leaves. And I believe that he is calling forth that phrasing from Jesus about the Spirit, those born of the Spirit, go where they will, like the wind and the leaves.
Well, and you also see that with, was the prophet that calls down the fire and then goes and hides in the wilderness?
Elijah, yeah, the still small voice.
You see that with Elijah, but then you also see that with Samuel when he has the moment where God calls out to him 3 times,
right?
In the night, that kind of a thing. Yeah, definitely.
Well, what I like about those 3 different callings is it corresponds then to the Trinity, right? The booming voice,
yes, definitely
the nurturing voice, and then the still small voice.
Yeah, and in different parts of Narnia, you get different epiphanies of God. It's not just Christ giving himself for a guilty person, Lion, Witch, and the Wardrobe. But at the beginning of Silver Chair, she gets called up to this high place, to Aslan's country, and he gives her these signs. You must remember the signs. And it's very similar to Moses receiving the 10 Commandments. And when she says, are you somebody? He says, I am. So there's a lot of those great illusions. You mentioned being called in the night. You remember in Prince Caspian when Susan and the others are camping out and someone calls her.
Yeah.
And she goes out, and it's very similar to Samuel. And then she says, oh, Aslan, you're so much bigger than you used to be.
Yeah. And
he says, oh, I've grown no bigger. Your capacity to see me has grown bigger. And that's straight of one of the mystics. That's from Catherine of Siena.
Yeah.
She says, God never changes, but our capacity to experience God will continue to grow throughout our lives.
And not to go back to Perelandra, my favorite Lewis book again, but at the end of Perelandra, when he's seeing Venus and Mars appearing to him, and they're trying to figure out what the best way to reveal themselves to human beings is, he actually has this experience of wheels within wheels.
Exactly.
Sort of hinting at maybe what Ezekiel was seeing was these angels trying to reveal themselves to him, and because they didn't know exactly how to interface with his brain and eyes or whatever, he saw this weird vision, but that's what he was seeing. It's an interesting thing that he throws in Perelandra. And then I also love in Perelandra where Weston has his sort of breakdown, and he kind of calls, the
I
demonic.
call that force within me.
Yeah, but that whole discussion when he's talking about the spirit and the spirit world, Ransom points out, well, isn't there a person? And there's that idea of, isn't there a person behind it, or is it just this sort of like depersonalized spirit with a capital S? And you see that in Lewis and all of those encounters that he has with Ransom and the darkness and all this stuff. There's always a presence and a person that he's encountering, as opposed to just the experience itself.
Well, that's what I love about Lewis's synthetic imagination, because he's partly satirizing the idea of the élan vital, the Bergsonian idea of the life force. When he says what you call good and evil, that's just the life force moving forward. And then he says, I call that force into me. And suddenly he becomes demon-possessed. He bites onto a bottle and breaks it in his teeth. Yeah. But see, he's synthesizing an intellectual parody of Bergson, but also that scene reflects his own experience of seeing Doc Askins, his mother's brother, fall to pieces.
Yeah.
So he would take life experiences and theology and biblical passages and weave them all together so cleverly. Also in Perelandra, the great dance at the end where all the angels have this great pageant of praise for Maleldil, for the creator.
Yeah.
A lot of those things they're saying are very close to famous phrases by mystical writers that Lewis knew very well.
Yeah. Well, and then that like ecstatic vision of them saying all those things that last for like a year or something, and they kind of come out of it and they realize all the animals have gone and they've been sort of having this vision for a year now or something. It's very fascinating.
Yeah. Some people say, well, Lewis must have taken drugs sometime in his life. And I go, no, I think that's his own mystical temperament, which has been aided by his deep reading in mystical writers.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
So, Crystal, we were talking before the podcast. You were saying that some of our other Wade authors have had encounters or experiences or studied and talked about mysticism. You mentioned Chesterton.
Yes. Well, we did one podcast several times ago about modernism and the modernist disdain for these Christians and how there was a special dismissal of G.K. Chesterton. And part of it is that Chesterton himself, recognizing the both and of what it means to be a Christian, that life is both material realities and spiritual realities, he refused to capitulate to the idea that everything is material. And of course, Darwinian evolution was really big, this idea that there is no God guiding the whole process.
Yeah.
It's just all material progress. And so he would often invoke mysticism as a way to acknowledge the awareness that there has to be something more than material realities. And I found a couple quotes that endorse that.
Yeah.
I'm not a Chesterton scholar, so I don't know if he had mystical experiences like Teresa of Avila or Julian of Norwich or St. John of the Cross. But here is how he uses it. First of all, it's in an essay on Blake. The mystic does not bring doubts or riddles. The doubts and riddles exist already. We all feel the riddle of the earth without anyone to point it out. The mystery of life is the plainest part of it. The clouds and curtains of darkness, the confounding vapors, these are the daily weather of this world. Whatever else we have grown accustomed to, we have grown accustomed to the unaccountable. Every stone or flower is a hieroglyphic of which we have lost the key. With every step of our lives, we enter into the middle of some story which we are certain to misunderstand. And here's another quotation that talks much more about contemporary philosophy of his day, which is very similar to the philosophy of our own day, the new atheists who just would dismiss anybody who believes that there are supernatural realities. He says, the philosopher thinks that the spiritual lies very far beyond the material, like a remote landmark behind a plane. The mystic thinks that the spiritual is very close behind the material, like a brigand hiding behind a bush. Science is always saying that the other world, if it exists, is too distant to be seen. Religion is always saying it is too close to be seen. Isn't that nice?
That is good. Yeah, that's great.
God is among us.
Can I add one more Chesterton quote?
By all
No.
means.
Oh, well,
Yes.
we have a split vote, so I guess I break the tie here. Chesterton also said, the morbid logician seeks to make everything lucid and succeeds in make everything mysterious. The mystic allows one thing to be mysterious and everything else becomes lucid.
Well, Chesterton influenced Dorothy Sayers a lot. She said that she would have become a logical positivist, a total materialist in her youth if it weren't for Chesterton. And she reflects his attitude quite clearly in this essay she wrote on Dante and the Beatrician vision. And here's how she defines mysticism. It is the immediate and intuitive awareness of an eternal reality. But it comes, she goes on to say, through the transfiguration of natural objects. So for her, she really emphasizes what she calls, and I'm pretty sure she got this from Charles Williams, what she calls the affirmation of images, that there is something called the negative way, which
The via
is
negativa, right?
a mystical way where there are no words or images that can even capture what you're experiencing.
Yeah.
And you even see that in St. Paul when he says, I went up to the third heaven, and you're kind of going, Paul, explain what you mean. What happened there? What did you see? And it's like he could not explain it. But for
He said, I saw things which cannot be uttered.
Yeah.
One of the
there
traits
it
of
is.
mysticism is ineffability.
Yeah.
Right. Whereas Sayers, and she got this from both Williams and I think was influenced by Chesterton this way as well, wanted to say that we can have mystical experiences through just the overpowering beauty of nature. And this is one of the essays where she quotes William Wordsworth at length. In our podcast on Romanticism, I said she never even talked about Wordsworth till she started reading Dante. And now, in order to explore Dante's mysticism, she accesses Wordsworth, who, of course, talked about splendor in the grass, glory in the flower. And she just quotes long passages of Wordsworth, who just is aware of other realities because of the beauty of nature. And this is why C.S. Lewis loved Wordsworth, because there's that type of mystical element in him.
Well, there's another mysticism scholar named Nathan Soderblom who talks about introverted mysticism versus extroverted mysticism. And he says some people are so overwhelmed by the beauty of nature and the stars and creation that they begin to look into their souls to find something that parallels the magnificence of the external world. Other people have this innermost exaltation and sense of peace and harmony and discover of God, and they start looking for it in the outer world. So he talks about those two. I think we need to bring in George MacDonald. So MacDonald also loved Wordsworth, and he felt that the inner mysticism and the outer mysticism ultimately met. Lewis called MacDonald a mystic who got seduced into writing novels. He thought that his ideas were better than his prose style. But this is a quote from George MacDonald about internal and external mysticism, or where do you find God? George MacDonald said, all about us in earth and air, wherever the eye or ear can reach, there is a power ever breathing itself forth in signs, now in a daisy, now in a wind waft, a cloud, a sunset. A power that holds constant and sweetest relation with the dark and silent world within us. The same God who is in us, and upon whose tree we are the buds, if not yet the flowers, also is all about us, inside the Spirit, outside the Word, and the two are ever trying to meet in us. That's a very mystical statement that Lewis would agree with, and mysticism scholars would say that's a beautiful uniting of the two.
Just real quick, I was going to say, MacDonald, I think you see this in MacDonald, and I would say you see this in pretty much everyone who is seeking some sort of mystical experience. One of the common denominators is they believe that what it means for us to exist, the end or the final purpose of our existence, is communion with God. And this is as opposed to what I would say is traditionally sort of a Protestant idea, is that the end or purpose of our existence is our salvation. And so once you're saved, then you get to go to be to heaven. And yes, we're going to be with Christ, but there's very much an ethical focus. Regarding
we're saved from our sins,
we're
and
saved.
Now we can go to heaven. Yay!
Exactly. But in the meantime, we're doing good works, and part of that is evangelism. But you see, and MacDonald says this actually in the Words of Jesus on Prayer in his second series of unspoken sermons. He says the final end of man, the purpose for our existence, is communion with God. And so if that is the reason that we exist, we were created to live in communion with God and with others, then why would you not be trying to seek that now? Right? You know it's going to be imperfect. You're going to have it in glimpses and sputters and experiences and things like that. And it may come upon you when you least expect it or when you seek it out. But that, I think, is a reason that is driving a lot of these people. And that might be helpful for some people that don't come from that background. That's a very, I would say, a common idea in Eastern Orthodoxy and Catholicism.
Right.
But a lot of Protestants don't come from that standpoint of the final end, the purpose of our existence is communion with God.
Right.
I think
And
you're
that is
exactly
so
right.
consonant with even the Genesis story that Adam and Eve chose their own self-interest over their relationship with God.
Yeah.
And that is what sin is, is choosing your own way rather than that communion.
Yeah,
Right.
definitely.
Another mystic that Lewis quoted was the anonymous, but it's called the Theologica Germanica, the German theologian. And he says the great battle is between the I self and the God self. It's not really heaven versus hell. It's as much as trying to take more and more of God's nature and giving up on our selfish nature. And I think the great divorce is built upon that whole insight. I think the idea of the great divorce is it's not that devils are trying to drag you down to hell. It's that you're refusing to give up your narcissism and your selfishness and your earthly souvenirs. And so some people turn their backs on God simply because they worship at the altar of the I self, not of the God self.
And not coincidentally, Lewis puts George MacDonald into The Great Divorce as the guide.
And the title comes from William Blake, who we considered fascinating but not very orthodox. I guess we all would.
Well, he was punning on William Blake because William Blake wrote The Marriage of Heaven and Hell. And so Lewis then says, well, it's The Great Divorce.
Yeah, you should go listen to our podcast that David did where he talked about the Great Divorce if you want to learn more about that. Just because I have it here, I wanted to read you the quote that I was referencing from MacDonald. This is from the Word of Jesus on Prayer. He says, "Communion with God is the one need of the soul beyond all other need. Prayer is the beginning of that communion, and some need is the motive of that prayer. Our wants are for the sake of our coming into communion with God, our eternal need." He's talking about why God makes us pray for things that he knows we need. And his point is because our ultimate need is communion with God.
Mm-hmm.
And if we just got everything that we needed, we would never come to him and ask and even seek him out. And so, anyways.
No, that's a very good quote. I think you're exactly right. We talk theologically or abstractly about justification versus sanctification. But pragmatically, Protestants tend to say, well, I got my soul saved. And they don't think about the purgation process or the illumination process.
Yeah.
N.T. Wright has a good book called After You Believe. It's kind of saying, okay, your soul is saved, you're going to heaven. Now what are you going to do for the rest of your life? And it's that exact point.
Yeah.
How do you grow in Christ?
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
You see Lewis talking about that also in Letters to Malcolm.
Right.
When he talks about, with this fictional character Malcolm about the question of purgatory. But his whole idea is, he's thinking about communion with God, and he's thinking, I need to sort of prepare myself for that in terms of purgation and those kinds of things like that.
Right. And in Four Loves, one of his definitions of mystics, he says they are those to whom they experience a foretaste of the fruition of God in this life. So they're actually kind of getting a piece of heaven in this life because they've been purged to the point that they can really... Now, you say Letters to Malcolm, that's a fictional character? It's not Malcolm Muggeridge or Malcolm Geist?
No.
When Walter Hooper met Lewis and he says, who is Malcolm? And Lewis said, "Oh, Walter, not you too." Everybody thinks it's got to be some real person.
Well, I think he's drawing from people he's talked to in his real life.
Yeah.
But why did he choose the name Malcolm if he made
kind of
it
a
up?
generic British name. He was trying to write a book on prayer starting in the 50s, and he never could figure out how to organize his material. So the great fallback for people who can't organize their material is to turn it into a fictional set of letters. They've been doing that for about 300 years now.
You don't need an organizing
Exactly.
principle.
Because how correspondence by nature.
Clarissa.
There's no plot. Yeah.
Right. Yes, but people always thought that must be a real person. I think it is. In one of the drafts, I think he called it Letters to C.
Yeah.
And I think there's quite a bit of Charles Williams in Malcolm. But maybe a little Barfield, this is a composite of several people.
I think you also see, it's interesting, we've talked about this before, sermons were really popular in MacDonald's day. And so he writes these unspoken sermons that are really just kind of like that, where it's just him talking about a topic that he wants to talk about.
They were the podcasts of the day.
Yeah, pretty much. So he just wants to talk about prayer. Why do we need to pray if God knows what we need? And so he talks about that.
Nowadays they call those blogs.
Yeah,
whatever's on your mind that day, go ahead and write it up.
But that's the point. Is like he sort of takes what he wants to say and makes it fit the format of the day, which
Right.
sermons were really popular back then for some reason, especially printed sermons. And then Lewis, he's thinking, how do I, and so letters, and this idea of letters comes to him. It's very interesting. People adapt the message to fit the time.
Yeah. Thomas Carlyle, the Victorian essayist, he had a bunch of drafts and fragments, and he couldn't figure out how to put them together into a book. So he created something called Sartor Resartus, which means the tailor resewn. And he said, well, this guy had all these great ideas, but he died, so I'm just trying to put these fragments together. So he had this fictional guy who died, and now he's just editing the fictional
That's
guy.
genius.
I think we wish we could all write that book, right?
Yes.
Yeah.
Before we finish, David, I think you should talk about your own personal experience as you were writing your book on mysticism in C.S. Lewis. Did you explain where you got the phrase "into the region of awe" first?
The word awe almost always meant for Lewis a numinous experience. In the Lewis lexicon, terms often had specific meanings. The name of my book, Into the Region of Awe, comes from Surprised by Joy, his memoir, in which Lewis says, into the region of awe, in deepest solitude, there is a road right out of the self, a commerce with the naked other, capitalized naked other, imageless, though our imagination salutes it with 100 images, unknown, undefined, desired. So that's a very mystical passage in his memoir for someone who's considered to be the Lord's logician. So I finished all my research, I finished all my writing, and I didn't know how to finish the book. Sometimes you want to go, well, them's my insights. Hope you enjoyed them, folks. See you later.
Sartor Resartus.
Exactly.
That's all, folks.
Yeah, that's all, folks. And I didn't know how to finish the book. And I spent probably 2 weeks with doing no new writing. I couldn't figure out how to conclude it. And then I woke up one night at 3:00 in the morning, and I sat down and wrote for 2 hours straight. And later on, I put that almost word for word into the ending of the book. And most readers say that's my favorite part of the book. And it's strange that I had no notes in front of me. I did very little revising. And some people like Julian Norwich, who are both Lewis and Eliot, Lady Julian of Norwich, she said that her revelations came to her all at once. An entire book came to her in a second, and it took her several years just to write down all the illumination she'd gotten in that moment. And in my own small way, I had this odd experience of clarity, and I knew in my head what I wanted to say over several pages and got it down almost word for word without revising. And that's my favorite part of the book. Still, I don't know if I would call that a mystical experience, but I felt like all this great studying of the mystics gave me a kind of spiritual and intellectual clarity about the subject, which was still a cherished memory of mine.
Well, thank you guys for letting me join you and talk about mysticism, and David for talking about your book. If you guys are interested, can people purchase Into the Region of Awe on Amazon or other places like that?
It's still available from Introverted Press. I'm hoping to bring it out in a renewed version from Paraclete Press, but that may take a year or two. A lot of people have said they really enjoyed the audio version of this book, Into the Region of Awe, from Blackstone Audio. The narrator has this charming British voice, and he just has this earnest delivery that I think really makes the material easier to assimilate.
Yeah, Blackstone Audio has done a number of Lewis books as well.
Right.
Interesting.
This whole issue of mysticism and C.S. Lewis has the potential to be evangelistic insofar as a church invited David a year ago to come speak about his book, Into the Region of Awe, but advertised it in the local paper as lecture on C.S. Lewis and mysticism. Now, people have heard of Lewis because of the movies, and they're interested in mysticism, so a lot of non-Christians showed up.
Oh, wow.
Because they say, I liked Lewis. I didn't realize he was interested in mysticism. And what they heard was a solid proclamation of the gospel message, because David proceeded to distinguish Christian mysticism from the generic belly button...
Navel gazing.
Navel gazing.
Yeah,
That's what it's called. Mysticism. So this is another reason I think Christians really need to pay attention to Christian mysticism
Yeah.
because it can be an evangelistic tool.
Well, it shows that that need exists in all people. If communion with God is what we were made for, then everyone is searching for that. They're just looking in the wrong places.
Yeah.
And once again, the famous mystic Augustine said, "Our hearts are restless until they rest in Thee," which Lewis quotes in The Four Loves.
Yeah, definitely. Okay. All right. So you guys go look for that online. Also, we've started a new thing with show notes. So we've made a bunch of references and things today. So if you go look in the description of the podcast, you can find a link to a PDF, and we'll link to all the different things that we've referenced, as well as a link to David's book if you're interested in purchasing that. And we thank you guys for joining us, and thank you for inviting me into your basement yet again.
Thank you, Aaron. Thank you, Crystal.
Beyond the basement.
Yes. Into the basement.
Yeah.
The Wade Center podcast is a production of the Marion E. Wade Center at Wheaton College in Wheaton, Illinois. Our hosts are the co-directors of the Wade Center, Drs. Crystal and David C. Downing. Our episodes are produced and edited by Aaron M. Hill. If you enjoy the podcast and the content we offer, please leave a review on iTunes and especially tell your friends. If you have questions about the podcast or suggestions for future episodes, please email us at wade@wheaton.edu or contact us via Facebook, Instagram, and YouTube. To learn more about the Wade Center, our 7 British Christian authors, and our resources, visit our website at wheaton.edu/wade.